Suppose we could really have entitled this this session "Ulster Unionism in Crisis" anywhere in the last 50 or maybe even 100 or maybe even 150 years, in the sense that Ulster Unionism is a political current that is, in a sense, born out of crisis. And it's probably better to think about a wider crisis in the north of Ireland, and the crisis of politics and the crisis of the state in that area. But what I'd like to begin with is to sort of concentrate on two recent items of news. One is the election of Edwin Poots as the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, and also something which in a sense is linked, and something which is an important context, is the recent Centenary, although we might also take it into June, or we might even go back a bit further, but we won't debate that. The centenary of the foundation of the Northern Irish state, an Irish partition, which has passed by relatively uncelebrated, certainly not by nationalists, and has been fairly mutedly dealt with by unionists, not just, I think, because of the COVID crisis, but also because in many ways Ulster Unionism is in a crisis, which in a sense is a political crisis, and problems about its future direction, and indeed about its relationship with Britain, and indeed the future of the Union. So let's begin with Edwin Poots. Poots was elected by 19 votes to 17 as leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the largest party in the Northern Irish Assembly. It's the first leadership election that party's had in its history. Previously, the leaders sort of emerged, or in the case of its founder, Ian Paisley, they didn't really bother with such democratic niceties as elections. They simply were just the sort of party that was around Paisley. So in itself, having an election was interesting, as was the circumstances that led to that election, the resignation of Arlene Foster as leader of the party, and all the ramifications that has. Now, Poots has come in for a great deal of comment in Britain, and much of that comment is pretty shallow. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on his religious beliefs. He's a creationist. He's a member of the Free Presbyterian Church, but again, that's not particularly unusual for that party. It was in many senses dominated by the Free Presbyterian Church, which is a small Protestant group founded again by Ian Paisley. But I think the more interesting thing is what direction Edwin Poots will take the DUP, and more importantly, the sort of dilemmas facing the DUP. The main issues facing the DUP, of course, are the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, the whole crisis that's been thrown up for Northern Ireland by Brexit, but also one or two really quite fundamental underlying tensions and problems about the future of that state and its relationship to Great Britain. Just to refresh people's memories, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was discussed and developed as part of the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, that protocol created a rather ambiguous relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. In particular, it said essentially that Northern Ireland remained within the European Union for various single market and various customs relationships. And so while Britain, the island of Britain, England, Scotland and Wales, withdrew from the European Union, Northern Ireland retained a relationship, and this was this was again linked to the not only to Britain's withdrawal, but also to the argument that a hard border, or so-called hard border on the island of Ireland, would not only interfere with the economy of the whole island, but would also be politically very difficult. Arguments were put forward that this border would stir up trouble, conflict, and so as a necessary condition for the withdrawal, it was decided that this border, this economic border, would be drawn in the middle of the Irish Sea. Now, again, what's interesting here, of course, is that during the Brexit negotiations and during all the tangled discussions that took place last year and in the years before that, Boris Johnson and before that Theresa May proposed to Northern Irish Unionists that Northern Ireland's constitutional and indeed its general status with the United Kingdom would not be affected. Johnson in particular said that there would be no border in the Irish Sea, that this was a ludicrous argument, and yet he went ahead and did that in signing this protocol. Perhaps moreover, he made a series of promises, as did Theresa May before him, that the position of Northern Ireland within the Union was secure. Ministers talked about the precious union. Johnson and various other Tory party figures even went so far as to travel to Northern Ireland, speak at DUP conferences, and generally build up their support amongst the DUP. Now, of course, this was absolutely crucial in the period when the Conservatives were in a very weakened position at Westminster following the 2017 election, and this gave a considerable amount of leverage to the DUP. The DUP, again, comrades, I'm sure will know, are often characterized as sort of constituting the right wing of unionism, and their origins as a right wing split in a sense in Ulster unionism, personified by Ian Paisley, the leading opponents of any sort of concessions to nationalism, opposition to the civil rights movement, and being very firm on defending the union. So Johnson, May's attempts to sort of play on that were necessary as part of the parliamentary game. But of course, as the DUP and other unionists have come to realize, Johnson was quite willing to sacrifice their political interests, quite willing to break the promises that he made about the Northern Irish Protocol, quite willing to break that and to sign the protocol because it seemed to be in the interests of British capitalism, in the interests of Britain as a whole, rather than of the distinctive interests of the DUP and of unionism in general. The wider issues of Brexit and Northern Ireland, and indeed the 26 counties, the state south of the border, were, I think, were very important. And the key question, of course, was that the southern state remained within the EU. Its ruling class was in a sense willing to go along with the EU. Perhaps more than that, it had made a fairly clear reorientation towards the EU. So whereas the Tory supporting Brexiteers were going to break, Dublin remained clearly committed to that project, and its ruling class was one with the other member states in its confrontation with the British government. This also reflected something of the divisions within the 6 counties themselves, so that unionists were in general, certainly in terms of a majority, unionists were in general supporters of Brexit. The DUP actually played something of a role in the Brexit campaign. It funded or was used as a conduit for funding pro-Brexit literature and campaigning and so forth. Whereas nationalists in general were opposed to Brexit. A variety of factors there. I think, you know, in many ways, at its crudest level, it was very much a case of opposing what was represented in Ireland quite generally as a revival of British nationalism, of British imperialism. And of course, if that sort of politics, which the Brexit Party and that Brexit wing of the Tories represented, and you know, very, very visibly did, then it would be quite natural for Irish nationalists to oppose that. But there are also economic interests as well. And so what you have with the Irish nationalist population of the 6 counties is a very clear orientation towards the rest of Ireland, towards its economy, and of course, as part of a wider project of reunification. So the referendum campaign in the north of Ireland was very much fought upon communal political lines, with nationalists in general opposing Brexit and unionists in general in favour of it. You know, there'd obviously been some sort of shifts in position because up until the early 2000s, Sinn Féin, the former Republican Party, had been opposed to the EU, had taken a sort of left anti-EU position, but increasingly that shifted, and as their politics shifted increasingly to the right, and they became very much part of the establishment south of the border, and of course working in the power-sharing government north of the border, their politics shifted accordingly, and so they opposed Brexit, and then became something of a rallying cry for them. So overlaying the general debate around Brexit is also a perhaps wider debate about Ireland, the whole island of Ireland, to use the jargon, its place within the European Union, its relationship to the European Union, and of course the position of Northern Ireland in relation to the Union as a whole. So those issues, in a sense, were being overlaid onto this debate. Now, the protocol was or does cause some economic disruption in the north of Ireland. That disruption, as far as we can tell, revolves around customs arrangements. It revolves around importing goods from the rest of the United Kingdom, from Great Britain, into Northern Ireland. So certain foodstuffs and certain other materials you know, can be delayed. I mean, there are numerous examples given of people trying to import agricultural products, foodstuffs, and other items which are held up. It's also clear, though, that some of those elements have been overstated. You know, there was quite a shortage of Stilton cheese at one point in Belfast, but I understand that that's now been rectified. So Stilton cheese lovers can rest assured that normal supplies have been resumed. But there is some quite serious economic disruption. Perhaps more importantly is the implications of this, which is, of course, for unionists, that the north of Ireland, its economy, and indeed its unionist population, can be sacrificed if needs be, can be abandoned, promises can be broken if needs be, for the wider interests of the British government. And particularly given Johnson's clear pitch towards the unionists, this has led to a considerable debate. It's led to considerable opposition, and I think it has led to really something of a political crisis within the DUP. The particular crisis for Arlene Foster was that she'd been misled, she'd been betrayed, and that her hostility or her failure to really confront Britain on this matter, to really stand up for Northern Ireland's interests, as it were, this was probably the the key point. In a sense, she became something of a scapegoat. Foster was always a little bit of an outsider in the DUP. I mean, there are various reasons for that. She wasn't a founder member of the DUP. In fact, along with Geoffrey Donaldson, she was a former member of the Ulster Unionist Party. And also, she comes from a different religious tradition. She's an Anglican, which in Ireland is a fairly low church form of Protestantism. But there are clear historical differences between Anglicanism and Presbyterianism, and she's also very much what we might refer to as a border Protestant. She's from down in Fermanagh. She's very different, I think, from those people who come from the DUP's heartlands, particularly in Antrim and parts of Down and Belfast. So she was always a bit of an outsider. But also, she was considered in the great scheme of things inside the DUP to be something of a social liberal. Her abstention on a gender conversion bill, this sort of gay therapy bill, her abstention on that, and indeed her arguments that she was not quite the hardliner that they wanted. So these are some of the sort of, the sort of personality issues, the sort of symbolic issues in a way, but probably there's a deeper political problem that the DUP face. And that, of course, is the changes and the developments inside unionism itself. Unionism's bottom line historically is maintaining the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, of course, as many comrades will know, the nature of that union, the form of that union, and how unionists see that union has shifted over time. But it's very clear that that's the centerpiece of their politics. Now, Foster was very clearly a unionist. There was no doubt about that. But her policies and her approach, and in particular, the way that the DUP appeared to have been suckered on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the symbolic importance of that had political ramifications. And it had political ramifications in two directions. Comrades will be aware that a few weeks ago, there were a number of I think, relatively small-scale protests organized by loyalist groups, which did engender a few days of rioting. Some of that rioting and violence had the potential to be intercommunal between nationalists and unionists. But it looked, and certainly it was emphasized, that there was a great deal of discontent in the unionist population, particularly in working class populations in Belfast and in Derry to a lesser extent. But this then became linked into a wider set of critiques of the current situation. The protocol was quite central in this, the sense that unionist interests, economic interests, the connections with the union, that these were in a sense being ignored. And so that the focus was on the protocol, and leaflets and banners and graffiti began to appear. No to border in the Irish Sea, defend the union. But also, perhaps more importantly, it was linked to a wider political sense that unionism was on the back foot. So proximate examples were given of, for example, concessions that had allegedly been made to nationalists, particularly the fact that their nationalist agenda was being secured, that loyalists and unionist interests were being ignored and undermined. All sorts of examples were brought in here: the legacy questions, the treatment of victims of the Troubles, the Sinn Féin's behaviour at the funeral of a leading IRA member, Bobby Story. All sorts of arguments were produced and were given as examples of continuing loyalist unrest and alienation. To that, we might also add the fact that for many working class people, whatever side of the peace war you're situated on, the peace process hasn't really brought any visible dividend. The COVID crisis has obviously strengthened some of those economic and social issues. So all in all, you've got the potential for unrest. Also, I think it's important to note that the DUP has got a certainly form in mobilizing and using that sort of discontent for its own purposes. Often, for example, encouraging demonstrations and resentments and activities, and then walking away, having, in a sense, incited unrest, and then claiming no knowledge of it. There's a whole history of this sort of communal politics, and the DUP are quite good and quite, effective at it. So there's this sort of, underlying discontent within the unionist population. But politically, this doesn't just express itself in rioting on the interface areas. It also reflects itself in the growth of groups to the right of the DUP. And also another tendency, but within the wider unionist population, is a shift from explicitly and openly hardline unionist parties to those that favour a softer form of unionism. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the DUP's political success has always been to, in a sense, control the right wing of unionism. And indeed, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it had successfully done that. So if you recall the Good Friday Agreement, the dominant unionist party at that point was the Ulster Unionist Party, and its leader, David Trimble, signed the Good Friday Agreement, took part in the executive, but found increasingly in the early 2000s that his electoral position was being undermined. And by the middle, by I think about 2003, the DUP had supplanted the UUP as the dominant party of the unionist population. And of course, we then got the historical deal, the Chuckle Brothers, the historic compromise, in which Ian Paisley joined a power-sharing executive that had Martin McGuinness, the Sinn Féin leader, as the Deputy First Minister. I mean, who can forget the heartwarming Chuckle Brothers routine between those two great statesmen as they went around the world from one stock exchange to one glittering gala occasion to another, showing the new Northern Ireland in which old enemies could work together and in which the old conflicts were being overcome. So that seemed to confirm that the DUP had, in a sense, shored up unionism. And of course, it maintained that position, often provoking crises in order to maintain the position that it was clearly in control, acting as effective communal representatives, fighting nationalists, showing that they stood up for the interests of the unionist people. There was always, though, elements to the right of the DUP, former DUP members. Jim Allister of the so-called traditional unionist voice, he split from them and he ran effective campaigns, but had no real party. And although they managed to pick up assembly members, they were quite regionally located, primarily in Antrim. They weren't really very effective. But of course, the position now facing the DUP, particularly since the last assembly elections, and of course the crisis over Brexit and over the Northern Ireland Protocol, has seen their electoral position under very, very severe threat. Opinion polls are only a guide, and we can't really say what would happen in next year's elections, or if there is a fresh election this year. That can't be ruled out. But the recent opinion polls tend to suggest that the DUP might well lose anything up to 5–10% of the vote, that the TUV coming in from the right may come up close behind them, and in that event, Sinn Féin could in fact find themselves as the largest party, and then under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement and the so-called Daunt system, find themselves having the position of First Minister. And you can imagine what a psychological blow that would be for unionists, that the Northern Ireland state, which had been established to give Protestants, and that was how it was framed, Protestants and unionists, a secure guaranteed majority within that territory, that had finally been undermined. Now, I think the other element that we need to look at is a certain hemorrhaging of support, not necessarily from the DUP as such, but probably more from the UUP and from what we might think of as the liberal sections of unionism. And this is a hemorrhaging away towards the Alliance Party. I recall following the resignation of Arlene Foster, Robert Peston, the ITV political journalist, tweeted that the DUP was under threat and that it might be losing votes to Sinn Féin. Well, again, for any people that know the north of Ireland, you'll be very well aware in the famous phrase that there are no swing voters here. There are no marginal voters. People don't move from the DUP to Sinn Féin. They might move from the DUP to the TUV. They might move from the DUP to the UUP. Even at an outside, they might move towards Alliance. But what won't occur is any significant, well, not significant, I can almost guarantee that virtually nobody will shift from a unionist party towards a nationalist party. Under PR, we can actually see this in terms of voter transfers. And I think someone has discovered that in the whole of Northern Ireland, about 4 people voted for the DUP who then did a vote transfer for Sinn Féin. But you can see that the normal electoral swings that psephologists and others like to talk about don't exist here. But what I think is occurring, and this perhaps then links back to some of the more fundamental questions that we will need to consider, is, I think, some other shifts going on, not only within the unionist population, but indeed with the wider population of Northern Ireland. As I said, Northern Ireland was formed. It was formed for several reasons. It was formed primarily by British imperialism, and we can obviously talk about the history of partition. It's quite an important point. But one of the key elements was to create a clearly defined area that unionists could control. And that meant that it had to be an area that was both large enough to be viable, but not the historic Ulster of 9 counties. It had to be an area that could be controlled, but with no risk of the unionist majority ever being outvoted or indeed outbred in normal demographic terms. So the demographic balance between unionists and nationalists at the time of partition was around about 70% unionists, 30% nationalists. That wasn't evenly spread throughout the whole of the 6 counties, and indeed 2 of the counties, Fermanagh and Tyrone, had nationalist majorities. And indeed, a close examination of the demographic geography of Northern Ireland would show really very much a patchwork, with large areas of South Derry, Derry City, parts of South Armagh, parts of South Down, parts of North Antrim up in the Glens, and Belfast and so on, having nationalist majorities. But the key point was that the state was designed to have a secure unionist majority. And that indeed was the real pattern of things, and remained the pattern throughout essentially the 100 years of the state's existence up until the present day. But of course, demography has shifted, and we only have to look at the current electoral map of the north of Ireland, the Westminster map, so that we can see that Sinn Féin, for example, have controlled the parliamentary constituencies of most of the areas west of the Bann, the river that divides Antrim and Down and Armagh. It's effectively west and east. It's around about 2/3 on the other side of the Bann. They effectively control those areas. So much of the land area of Northern Ireland is now represented by Sinn Féin MPs. There are also a couple of MPs. The SDLP have MPs in Derry and also in South Belfast. But the point is, this territorial shift also reflects a demographic change. It means, for example, that the unionist majority, which was so overwhelming throughout much of the history of the Northern Ireland state, has now really decisively shifted. And it's quite possible, although we have no clear figures as yet. The census occurred really just last month, so it's still too early to tell. But it's quite probable that unionists will either be in a minority in this census, or will be very clearly, held to within a couple of percent. In other words, that the demographic securities that this state was established to uphold have really been upturned. So that adds, I think, a really fundamental set of unease and a set of problems for unionists, with the possibility that electorally they may be a minority. It's certainly clear, again, if we're thinking in terms of demography, that amongst the young, that the nationalist population is growing. There's probably now a majority of people under 25 who are Catholics, and that will just continue to accentuate. So demography and electoral shifts really pose problems for unionists and how they respond to them. I think also, though, that Brexit has also thrown up a number of quite fundamental questions. And this is also taking place in a wider debate about the future of the Northern state. Now, academics and indeed others like to often posit that in Northern Ireland that we've got the clear positions around the constitutional status of the North posed between unionists and nationalists. And it's often as crude as Catholic and Protestant, because the assumption is that Protestants will support the union and that Catholics will favour reunification. And indeed, our demographic information largely rests upon those sorts of arguments. But of course, it's not entirely simple, and it's not entirely as clear as that. Although there is a generality that we can say that most, indeed an overwhelming number of people who might identify themselves as Protestants will favour the continuation of the union, and the majority of people who regard themselves or define themselves as Catholics will want some form of reunification. There is indeed a lot of fuzziness and a lot of a certain lack of clarity around those oppositions, and in particular a theme which governments play up, sociologists, and indeed what we might think of as the liberal academy throw up, which is the emergence of other forms of politics, particularly around issues of identity and the possibilities of what people refer to as the new Northern Irish identity. And this is often mapped onto the growth of political parties that are not framed primarily as unionists and nationalists, particularly the growth of the Alliance Party. If we listen to the BBC, the phrase is usually the non-sectarian, Alliance Party, and then of course the Greens. And it's estimated that somewhere in the region of about 20% of the population will identify themselves as being neither unionist or nationalist. Now, this is all very much in the realm of speculation, and why I bring this in is that much of the politics and much of the debate turns around whether unionists who currently vote, or Protestants who currently vote for the DUP or the UUP, can be persuaded to vote for a party like Alliance, who are in a sense liberal unionists. Their politics correspond broadly to those of the Liberal Democrats. They want to maintain the union, some with greater degrees of enthusiasm for others. But they're very much, I suppose, a status quo party in that regard. So arguments that Alliance represents some sort of way forward. I've heard this argument put that they are a sort of non-sectarian argument, but what they essentially are is for a continuation of the status quo. But it's very clear that electorally for unionists, there has been a growth amongst people who might well have been styled unionists. There's been a growth of this type of politics. And of course, if enough unionists defect from the Ulster Unionist Party and they vote for Alliance, that again will lessen the voting potential. Again, the recent opinion polls, ones carried out in February, I think, would suggest that if trends continue, then Sinn Féin could well be, the largest party, and then provide the first minister. So again, I've talked about the horror story that would constitute for unionists. Now, the talk has begun to look at has begun to talk about unionism, but I think that the crisis or the issues really need to be broadened out and to consider the situation confronting really the whole of the north of Ireland, the Catholic, the nationalist population, as well as the unionists. Because of course, if we accept that narrative of the onward march of nationalism, demographic determinism, and unionist retreat, then we can presume some form of reunification will take place at some point. But of course, if we look at the strategy of the nationalist political parties, and if we look at the nature of that nationalist population, I think the situation is far from clear. And for that, I perhaps need to clarify the nature of the political settlement that has emerged since 1998. Now, comrades, I'm sure will be well aware of the basic political divisions within the north of Ireland. But the 1998 settlement, although it was framed in terms of reconciliation, of this new Northern Ireland, of peace, of conflict resolution and so on, was essentially a stabilization project. And it was a stabilization project developed by the London government, by the British government, and by Dublin, with a number of international sponsors, primarily from the United States, but also from the European Union as well. And this project of management and of stabilization, in a sense, had been developed in various forms from the 1970s, when Stormont had been suspended, and when the British state was facing an insurgency and an insurrection from the urban working class population and the rural poor, headed by the Republican movement. So the policy of the British state was one of stability, of stabilization, and Dublin, were joined in this. Dublin politicians had essentially accepted partition, really from the 20s, and despite the fact that it was often politically useful to play the nationalist card and to campaign against partition. De facto, they were quite happy with a 26-county Catholic state, and you know, that's where they wanted to remain. Now, the Northern crisis in the 70s really posed problems. Not only did that crisis threaten to spread threaten to spread south, destabilizing that state. The burning of the British Embassy in Dublin in 72 is a good example of that. But the arms crisis in 1970 into 1971, and I suppose the pressure that Dublin governments often faced about you know, acting to in favour of the Northern nationalist population did put considerable political pressure on them. But essentially, Dublin governments had always worked very closely in partnership with London. And although the patterns and the forms of the status quo might shift, the basic fact of the Union and of British general strategic interest and indeed state interest in stabilising that union remained. So various attempts were made throughout the last 50 years. The Sunningdale Agreement in 74, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 85, and then, of course, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Now, the elements of that agreement were essentially to recognise that Stormont could not be restored. Britain had really accepted that in 1972, but now was looking for a way to reconfigure rule. But the other key element that London had come to accept was that nationalists could not be permanently excluded from some sort of form of participation in the government of the North of Ireland. So their policy was to try to develop partners that represented the nationalist population that could be brought into government. Now, there were constitutional nationalists, the SDLP are the most important ones, but of course the key problem was to find partners that from the unionist population. And one of the points during this period was that unionists could not be brought into this consensus. That the opposition to Sunningdale was an example of that. The Anglo-Irish Agreement likewise. So the tendencies towards instability and quite fundamental division remained. And the Northern, the peace process, the incorporation, the attempt to bring in nationalists, and above all to bring in the militant wing of nationalism in the form of the Republican movement was a key aim of the British. And they succeeded in doing that. That process of bringing in militant republicanism into government and for militant Republicans to scale down their ambitions to go from the 32-county Socialist Republic to a verbal commitment to reunification, but in practice to become, in Northern Ireland itself, to become simply the ethnic or the communal champions of the Northern nationalist population was really how they began to develop. So that agreement was in a sense a management of the conflict, but it also left all sorts of open possibilities. One of the ways to draw in militant nationalists was to persuade them, and indeed to persuade their followers, their electorate, that at some stage through this constitutional mechanism, it might be possible to reunite Ireland, so that if nationalists gained a majority, then the possibilities of the reunification in that way were there. But it was also done to persuade unionists that such an eventuality was unlikely, and that they too would then retain their majority and retain their position. So these dynamics of conflict remained in the 6 counties, and the pattern that was established at the time of partition, the pattern of communal division, of management of communal division, of nationalist of politicians who tried to represent their community, who tried to gain concessions for their community, opposed to unionist politicians who maintained their position by playing up the threat from the Catholic population, by attempting to gain concessions for sections of unionism. That basic communal politics was not ended in 1998. It was actually institutionalized and structured into the polity. So the point that we have here is that this crisis, along with earlier preceding crises, I mean, you know, there's usually a crisis every 3 or 4 years at Stormont, and since 1998, the Assembly and the Executive has been more often in suspension than it has actually been in operation. So the arguments that this represented some sort of historic compromise, some sort of, you know, transformative process, you know, were clearly just wrong. And despite the rhetoric of people like Tony Blair, you know, they've been proven to be wrong. So the basic conflict essentially remains. It remains because the state is based upon the management of that conflict. And of course, any attempt, I think, to resolve it within that pattern is likely to prove fruitless. So there we have, I think, you know, the key point. Now, why this current price, why this current crisis is so significant is not only does it disturb relations between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, but it also disturbs relations between London and Dublin. As I said, London and Dublin are, in general, effective partners when it comes to the consolidation of politics in the north of Ireland. But Brexit has obviously opened up fissures. And so you've got this sort of contradiction between Dublin as a committed member of the European Union that defends the interests of that union against a London that you know, is opposed to them. So there's obviously a contradiction there. But there's also, I think, another political problem, and that, of course, is the emergence of Sinn Féin as a political force south of the border. Because if we're talking about instability in the north, Sinn Féin's emergence as the second largest party, according to opinion polls, and probably in the event of any sort of election, a prime contender to be a partner in coalition, that then changes, I think, the political balance. It also means that that Sinn Féin's agitational demands, particularly their attempt to pose themselves as the anti-establishment party, the party that is committing to transforming Southern society, that also has to be linked to events in the north. And that's why one of their key demands for a border poll is really now quite a central theme. And why, to a certain extent, the demography that I talked about earlier has, you know, again, moved center stage. Although it's never really very far away, it's always in the back of minds of people in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin's demand for a border poll has been taken up more widely in the nationalist population. It's not met with a great deal of enthusiasm for the Dublin ruling class, who are really very lukewarm, indeed really quite opposed to reunification, or at least reunification in any meaningful sense, some sort of reconfiguration of the border, some other sort of new structures of variable geometries of power, all the usual sort of things that we come across in political science. There's some arguments around that, but in practice, Dublin is very reluctant to go much further than it has. The Good Friday Agreement, which gives them a degree of influence, but essentially stabilizes the northern state. That's really, I suppose, their bottom line. So Sinn Féin finds itself in the position of using the border poll, not only to, in a sense, big itself up in the 6 counties, but also to pose as the radical Republican Party south of the border. So this campaign is building up something of a head of steam. It is a central demand that they're making. And indeed, many people on the left in Ireland have joined in. There was a recent conference effectively organised by the Socialist Workers Movement, People Before Profit, who were really pushing this idea of a border poll and an alternative united Ireland. Now, I want to sort of wind up and just sort of talk about whether that's a viable option, and maybe to begin the discussion about what sort of demands socialists should be making in all of this. It's very clear that the Republican movement's campaign for the reunification of Ireland, that revolutionary struggle, came to an end decisively in 1998, but in many ways it had already run out of steam by the late 1980s. And the sort of conditions that created that, the urban insurrections, the civil rights movement, the mass mobilization of nationalists, those conditions can't be reproduced. You can't just simply conjure up a mass movement. The north of Ireland has changed. The position of Catholics inside in northern state has changed. And going back to what I said earlier, large numbers of particularly middle-class Catholics are quite happy with the status quo. They would obviously like to see improvements, and indeed would often vote for a party that would militantly confront unionism within the framework of the status quo. So they vote for the best communal fighters, not to smash that system, but in some ways to work within it. And that, in a way, is Sinn Féin's role, that they manage that system, they fight within it to obtain concessions particularly, as I said, for sections of the Catholic middle class. So the situation, I think, has really quite fundamentally changed. My opposition to a border poll is partly based upon the change in those sets of conditions, but also because it's being framed within the communal politics of the north of Ireland. That the demand for a border poll is framed within the structures of the Good Friday Agreement. It is, for example, will only be carried out by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It will be carried out under his aegis. He will frame the question. In other words, that this is not part of a revolutionary democratic struggle for a new reunified state. It's really a constitutional rearrangement being carried out by the British. And all that it will do is to intensify the communal divisions and the communalized forms of politics. So I think that we should oppose that border poll argument, but we should still be in favor of the reunification of Ireland. Partition was a disaster. Connolly called it a carnival of reaction. And the history of the last 50 years or so, the last 100 years, has proven that to be the case. So our demand should be for Irish reunification, but that struggle isn't one that's going to be carried out by governments. It's not going to be carried out by Dublin. It's not going to be carried out by reconfigurations by the established order. That struggle has to be a revolutionary democratic struggle. It has to be the one that replaces the border with an all-island state. But of course, it also is one that recognizes that the unionist population in the north of Ireland have distinct characteristics. I don't regard them as a nation, but they very clearly regard themselves as some sort of political community. But it's a political community that's trapped inside the northern state. It's also a political community that has no real interest in maintaining the union, despite what its leaders and despite what certain British politicians say. So it must be, I think, Irish reunification, but in a revolutionary way, as opposed to constitutional reconfigurations and border polls. The basis for that struggle at the moment mass movement that would be necessary on both sides of the border, and above all, the mass movement that we would need in Britain as well, because British workers obviously have to support the Irish struggle for self-determination and for the democratic resolution of partition. That movement is clearly not in existence now, but it's a movement and it's a struggle that we should attempt to undertake. So we have to oppose both the border poll, but also we have to recognize that the Good Friday Agreement has really, in a sense, solidified and communalized politics even further. We have to oppose that structure, and we have to look forward to the struggle of the working class to carry out these democratic tasks. We also have to recognize that that we have, or we're presented with in the short term, I think, the continuation of crisis, that in a sense the pattern that has been developed by the Good Friday Agreement is likely to continue, and that although Poots may well become the leader, there may well be a new DUP First Minister. Various people are being touted. Mervyn Story seems to be the favourite at the moment. That this will not present any long-term solution. And of course, the electoral problem that the DUP and that unionism may face is one that it may fragment between those who are prepared to work this system in some senses, talk tough, as Poots has done on the protocol, fight nationalists within the current dispensation, but they may also lose votes to those who go even further to the right and really want to return to the good old days and, in a sense, reject the current status quo. On the other hand, there are also sections of the unionist population who their interpretation of the crisis is an attempt to make the system work, and many of them will look towards alliance. So we have, I think, just a recipe for continuing crises, and those crises, may take very severe forms. The actual outcome and the actual pattern, I think, is unclear, but certainly next year's elections could see the growth of support for nationalist parties. They could see further weakening for unionism, and then in that sense, there is still a lot of uncertainty, but the basic patterns of conflict, the basic patterns of instability, which were created by the existence of a northern state, they're going to continue. It's just now a case of what form and which forces will emerge. What's very clear at the moment is that the revolutionary, the democratic solution is not the one that's on the cards. Those forces don't exist at the moment, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't attempt to build them, that we shouldn't attempt to fight for a democratic resolution of the division of Ireland and the carnival of a reaction that it created. Anyway, comrades, I'll leave it there for the moment.